How's it going, Chris? So, I'm actually drinking out of a nice jug or mug just like you were, except this isn't water. This is a good old-fashioned vodka tonic. There are a few things better when it comes to alcohol than that. You asked me about video games. I actually see video games getting used a lot in the educational sphere. There's a website called Cool Math Games, which are basically like old Flash games, things like Unblock Me and other things where you have to deal with order of sequence and angles, and you have these physics engines in the games that you have to adapt to in order to accomplish a goal. And they help develop students' critical thinking skills and a bunch of other types of knowledge bases, like understanding angles and vectors and things like that. And the kids love them because they're just fun, and it's better than sitting there listening to a teacher. But I think the video games are just going to become more and more important as we move into the future, because they have already figured out how to exploit a kind of interactive Socratic educational method. And Socratic method is basically just standing around asking questions. Gee, I wonder what happens when I do this, and seeing what happens with it. And video games have always worked like that. You play a video game and you're like, I'm going to do it like this. Oh, nope, I died. I'm going to go back through it and I'm going to do it like this. I wonder what happens if I change the way I do it and I actually move over here instead of over here. And it works out really well, and people learn really quickly. And they move from a novice person or level of experience and completely inexperienced, and they move through it fairly rapidly through a high level of experience. And it's going to become more prevalent with games like the Keble, or I can't remember how you pronounce it now, space program, that's teaching you physics simply because you're playing a fun game. You're learning physics, and if the physics engine in the game is at least mostly representational of our physics that we have to deal with, then you're learning what it actually takes. You're learning rocket science, like you said, and that is awesome. On a completely different note, my wife and I the other day, we were talking about something, and religion came up, as is wont to do with us, because we like to talk about religion. We find it to be a fun subject, and we are also big fans of sexual health and not letting things stay taboo. I got on a rant about the story of Onan, and I'm not sure if you're familiar with the story of Onan, but it is the basis for the ban against masturbation in the Mormon Church and the ban on contraception and masturbation in the Catholic Church. And I got curious, so I actually looked it up and I read the story of Onan. And the story of Onan is 5 verses, and it's a small part of the actual story that was important to what was going on. But it's the bit that everybody focuses on. In short, Judah has 2 sons, and Onan. Dies because he's displeasing to God, and God has him killed, because he's a kind, loving God. And then wife, Tamar, is without offspring, so there's nobody to inherit Ur's belongings. And the ancient Jews practice levirate marriage, which is where the husband of the brother of the dead husband, rather, would impregnate or marry the widow, so that, and then any offspring would be raised as the offspring of the dead brother. And Onan was ordered to do this by Judah, his father, and he went, and instead of impregnating Tamar, he spilled his seed upon the ground. And this was displeasing to God, so God killed him because he displeased God. And that's the bit that everybody stops at, that says, oh, you should only have sex so that you can procreate. And oh, you shouldn't masturbate and spill your seed upon the ground. These are evil things and they're sins, and God will kill you and strike you down. But the story goes on for another 20 or 30 verses. And it continues on that then Judah looks at Tamar and says, you know what? Just stay unmarried. You can live in my house. When my youngest son, Shelah, or however you pronounce it, grows up to be a man, I'll give you to him to be his wife, and then he can give you children to raise as Ur's kids for the inheritance. And Tamar's like, okay. Well, eventually, Shelah grows up. Tamar realizes that she's not going to get to marry him. And Judah one day goes out to shear his sheep. So Tamar disguises herself as a prostitute and then charges Judah a goat to sleep with her because his wife is dead and he's a lonely man, and after all, you should only have sex for the act of procreation. And this is where that argument kind of makes sense, honestly, based on the text. But she, in disguise, so that Judah doesn't recognize her, says, you know what, until you send me the kid, I want a down payment, a pledge that you will actually pay me. So I'm going to take your signet, your bracelet, and your walking staff. And he's like, okay, no problem. So they have sex. She becomes pregnant. She goes home, dresses up like Tamar again. The next day, Judah tries to send the goat to her as payment for services rendered, as it were. And he can't find her. She's nowhere around. So he's like, whatever. She can keep the walking staff and the signet and the bracelet. I'm going to go home now. And 3 months later, Tamar's pregnant. And because, prostitutes are awful, which is why Judah went and visited one, he's like, oh, she's pregnant by harlotry because she's not married, so obviously it must be harlotry, which that means she must be burnt alive. So as they're pulling her out to burn her alive for being a harlot, she's like, oh, hang on a second, Judah, you remember this stuff? Yeah, who does this belong to? This is the guy who got me pregnant. And Judah said, oh, oops, well, she's obviously been more righteous than I have because I didn't give her Shelah to wed, and I ended up giving her the offspring that my family owed her. And then it makes sure to say in there that he never knew her again, and this is the no in the biblical sense. And then it goes into the whole story, and I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, about the twins that were born, and one of them stuck their hand out during the birth, and a crimson ribbon was tied around it, and then the hand was pulled back in, and then the other baby came out first. And this is the whole big shebang story later on about a guy wearing a coat and pretending to be his brother because his brother was hairy and he wasn't, with his blind father, and just a big deal through there. But the entire story, the injunction against birth control and the injunction against healthy masturbation is based on, is a story based around the fact that nobody wanted to knock this chick up, and God was pissed off. Biblical logic, man. I'm going to make that a hashtag.